There are many questions raised in this last piece about skepticism, but also we have possibilities with even questions about what we have heard before. So it's quite open for any questions. Okay, I guess there could be rather many ideas and what your the questions that you have got. I can say I have, yes, Erik?
Kan vi begin? Eller vänta på inspelningen?
Det är klart.
So the camera is rolling?
Yes.
Okay, yes.
The question from yesterday evening that we cut. If you would please elaborate on the human future in case of research results get well known among the public or get worldwide known. What will happen with the human race and the human future?
That's interesting. So the question is, what will happen to the human race in our future if the results of what has been discussed get well known? Again, Oslo had the same question. What would the world be like if there was absolute evidence that you do survive after death? And Chris had the answer.
I can't remember that. I did have the answer.
We all had different ones, I think, on the panel. For me, I know the question is saying, what if that evidence was there? What if it was like that and everyone believed it? They accept it, if everyone accepted the evidence because it's there, and so people had their opinion on that. Mine was still that I'm not certain that there ever would be a world like that. The Bigelow essay competition was one example that there is a good collection there of some, you can pick and choose the essays, but they contain some really compelling evidence that should be enough to satisfy people. In fact, when you compare it to many other sciences, they're not asked to produce so much. We've met demands and more so to show all of this evidence beyond what other sciences have demanded, and so there's quite a lot of compelling evidence there. But you will still, because of different cultures and belief systems, you'll not convince everyone. And so if it does exist, the world will still be the same as far as I see it as it is now. Because it's happening and it is a reality, but whether you choose to believe that or not, whether you choose to accept the evidence or not, whether you choose to look at what lab studies have produced, if indeed they've managed to do lab studies on it, I don't think it's going to cause any major shift in the human condition and how we think or feel. That was my sense. I don't see that as a bad thing necessarily, it's just the way it is. There are many other areas of science where people aren't overly convinced by the results, regardless of the fact that it is happening, and that is the fact of the matter in those other sciences as well. Those people dealing with that will continue to research it, and the people that accept it will also continue to talk about it and contribute. You won't convince everybody, I don't think, but I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. That's my personal view.
So I was going to jump in and say, well, it depends what it is that everybody knows, because if it's simply the fact of survival, without any sense of the nature of that surviving or its relationship to what we do on Earth, then it's quite a minor thing, and actually only brings us back to the time we had before the Enlightenment, when the vast majority of people on the planet believed in an afterlife, and we saw how that might have played out in the way that they behaved to one another in terms of morals and scruples. So I think it is very difficult to predict what impact simply knowing with conviction in the fact of survival, how that might affect people. It's very like, for me, some of the phenomena particularly that Peter discusses is a little like knowing about the Atlantic by paddling your feet on a beach. And we go maybe ankle deep into the Atlantic, so we know the Atlantic exists. But it's unfathomable, literally. We have no idea what that existence might be like. It may be a complete cosmic joke. We may continue to exist for minutes after our biological death, but it's enough for us to be able to report near-death experiences and things. Mediums may all be psychic and maybe simply accessing the Akashic records or kind of some kind of cosmic consciousness. Peter's notion of what survival would be like, this assimilation into the great Brahman, it is very different from the kinds of afterlife that mediums describe, because they describe people who have the same personalities that they had while living. They're still intact, separate individuals, separate personalities, and the mediums that I speak to have been the ones that say, you know, and it follows from Harry Price, this idea that, you know, if you're a cantankerous person in this life, you may continue to be cantankerous in the next life. There isn't a sudden epiphany and you become a transformed individual. I've no idea. You know, that's what we hear from some mediums who come through, and certainly, you know, the communications are very familiar. You know, so your Auntie Nellie has exactly the same preoccupations she had when she was alive. She still favours this nephew over this one. You know, so I don't know what that means for what the afterlife is like, and therefore what the lessons are for what we might do differently here and now.
Would you answer the same question differently if you also think about telepathy, PK, and precognition?
Well, this is the one that Cal alluded to a little bit. So Jim Alcott, very famously in one of his skeptical books, begins with a preface where he says, what would life be like if in a world in which psi were real? You know, it would be terrible because despots would be able to know about conspiracies to overthrow them, etc., etc. Well, the fact is that the world would be this world if psi were real, because this is the only world there is. You know, so if psi is real, this is what you get. You know, so you get a highly imperfect, inconsistent type of psi that sometimes can be really valuable and useful. So it might allow you to avoid a disaster or to come to somebody's aid. But very often we're very poor at making sense of those inklings and acting on them in a productive way. Most of the time it kind of passes us by. But that's the world we have. So if psi is real, this is what you get.
Okay. Okay, Matti. We'll have one more go.
I wanted to say that we spoke yesterday about hope, that these communications bring about a sense of possible meaning. And I think you have a distribution of people, and some will never be convinced, some believe, but the quality of communication might change at some instance. For instance, when you have a solar eclipse, all animals react collectively. So at certain points, historical events, people get synchronized. They remember the death of John F. Kennedy and such things. You have remarkable events, and these kind of synchronize. And what happens is, if people are not so scared of death, whatever they believe about the afterlife, they will change the way of communicating. And that will be a change in the field, a change of the quality of consciousness allowed for each individual. So I think you could have a remarkable change in the quality of communication if we get rid of this irrational fear.
And Peter certainly referenced the idea of death anxiety, and I think it is a real phenomenon and people react badly if they are fearful in that way. I think you've touched on something which is quite important for me, it kind of touched a nerve, which is if people were able to realise the golden rule, if we were able to demonstrate empirically that we are deeply interconnected one to another, such that if you hurt another person, you are in a meaningful way hurting yourself, we're all part of a single collective entity, that I could see having a profound impact on the way that people think about things and the way they live their lives. I'm less confident that I'd be able confidence that we have an afterlife in itself is enough. You know, people struggle in this life and see it as bleak and hopeless. And if they do, I don't see any reason why they shouldn't necessarily think the next life is going to be less bleak or hopeless.
I could add that I guess we are influenced very much with this phenomena and the conclusions. I mean, being connected, the more there is moral responsibility, free will, very basic existential issues that will be influenced by realizing this phenomena real. What responsibility do I have for myself when I interact with other people? Deeply questions, and that's very big issue. How does that may change our way to interact with other people? And can we take all that? I mean, we can't take normal processes. We get yellows, etc., and we can't help that. We have limitations in how we can deal with normal processes, and these are even deeper and still more difficult to take care of. So there are lots of possible ways to handle these things, and so difficult to know. I mean, some people can grow, others can't, individually and in groups.
Right at the back.
Okay, yeah,
Yes.
Sola, yes.
Thank you. Well, I want to give an example for, if we know that we would survive that. Because my son, my grown-up son, had a friend that had experience of spirits and so on. Well, normal, not so much. So he believed in an afterlife. And he killed himself because of that. Because he was depressed and he thought, oh, it's okay, because I know I will live again, I won't die. So that could also happen that we kill each other, or ourselves much. Well, maybe that also, because maybe we don't value people as much. Or
I mean, it sounds very kind of like, for most people when they hear about that it's very deep and perhaps morbid, but actually in planetology, which I deal with when it turns to things like suicide, you ask about, well, what's actually going on there? There were even debates long ago. I was recently looking at the Cosmo Society in Nottingham, and sometimes them having an easy debate of whether a sane person can actually commit suicide or not, which are debates of long ago. But why? In modern day, and we bring in hope into it, why might that happen? It could be a number of things, such as physical or mental pain that someone is going through, and they decide that that's the only way out. Another thing could be due to events in their life as well, and that diminishing hope, and thinking, oh, I'm reaching a level now where there's absolute despair and hopelessness. So what do I do next? So if they start to decide to do that, they might edge their bets. And it could be, again, a win-neutral situation, as I saw with the after-death communications in my PhD when I was looking at hope. One would be that to take one's life will actually end the pain and suffering and resulting in nothingness. And so I can't be in pain. If I'm experiencing nothing, I cannot be in pain. I won't even know about it. Or there might be an afterlife. If they're certainly aware of other people having these experiences, this kind of research and data, so it's either nothing or something, which is better than a bad thing. You know, there being some sort of fire and brimstone and hell and damnation that very few people have ever experienced. The vast majority of people report it as this nice, pleasant detachment from the body and drifting off into something. But we also know that during some of the points of suicide as well, that a defence mechanism kicks in. Sometimes there is this zest for life at the moment that people want to go. Sometimes there's that your life flashing before your eyes, just as something's about to happen, but also in the whole taking of one's life, there's this adrenaline rush and a need to fight back against slipping into death. Some people have been convinced of the evidence, though. I believe that Arthur Koestler and his wife, I mean, isn't that why they put down the money for the Koestler chair in some regards? They were so convinced that it was going to happen, or did they do that for other reasons? I always assumed they were adamant the data was that good, and that was one of their reasons for their pact.
Yeah, I mean, he was familiar with the literature to date, through the J.B. Ryan kind of work.
Yeah.
I was persuaded by it. I mean, one of them was terminally ill.
Right.
And so then they formed a pact. I think he was terminally ill. And so the condition would be progressive and more painful.
Yeah.
And that's why they committed suicide together.
I mean, there's one famous example of being aware of the evidence and then them saying, this is the way out. People choosing instead of just letting nature take its course.
Interestingly, people who've had near-death experiences as a result of suicide tend not to feel suicidal anymore. So they tend to have some kind of a sense that actually, this is a wonderful, attractive place that I want to go to when it's my time, but actually suicide is not the method to get there, which is really interesting, because I don't know how that necessarily impacts on their current life experience, because they may be in chronic pain psychologically or physically, but they find some other way to cope with it. I mean, the standard treatment for chronic pain involves meaning making. So much of the pain we experience is actually in our head between our ears, rather than in our physical body. And there seem to be ways in which we can hold that pain more effectively that maybe the NDE can give us a light to. Here.
Ulf for the förra. Ulf, yes. Yeah.
Yes, it seems like the research supporting survival is rather overwhelming, actually. But I was thinking, not all research results support the same type of survival. So either it's a cosmic consciousness, or it's like after-death communications, and that seems to suggest that the self itself survives. So could you elaborate on your views? Was it a cosmic consciousness? The self survival?
Well, I guess you could frame it in maybe more Buddhist terminology. So there's an evolution here. So, for example, some of the reincarnation evidence is really intriguing.
Yeah.
So that also suggests something. And so this notion of an evolution of consciousness for the individual could lead to different pathways, some of which are more linked to an assimilation, some of which mean that you need more ego involvement, at least for another lifetime. So something like that is possible. I'm bamboozled, really. I'm completely perplexed by it. So that, for example, Peter was describing how we have different people waiting to greet us as we reach end of life, and they all seem like constructions to me. So I have no real sense that this truly is my Auntie Nellie who's coming to greet me to the next life. It may just simply be that what will be most comforting for me in order to allow me to transition is to be met by my Auntie Nellie. And that for somebody else, like children, for example, with near-death experiences, they often encounter their pets. Or so other people who are deeply religious might encounter angels or Jesus Christ. And they are symbolic, rather than, for me, in any real sense, kind of ontologically real. And so that, for me, means there's a very thick veil between this life and the next, in terms of what to expect. Now, we have the Bigelow competition, and I'm really looking forward to because I've never had the time, getting to grips with the literature on exactly what is the nature of the afterlife. We've never had time to do that. We've been too wrapped up, I think, in evidencing that this is the continued survival of this personality, what kind of messages are they giving, and how do you as a client respond to that. And so the new competition gives some scope to actually dive into a different literature, which is based on accounts from seasoned mediums primarily, who give a longer account of what is the afterlife like. But I suspect that they are going to be inconsistent and discrepant, so that they're not contradictory when I look at those.
How do you know for that?
Yes, I follow up about this discussion about if we get evidence about the afterlife, how we will change. And I think, it depends if in what way we get those or accept those evidence. I mean, if we just, as I think we discussed here, in an analytic sense with our intellect, accept it. Well, it seems plausible. But the other way is we can go to NDEs, for example, that you get some personal experience that is deep in you. I mean, and all these kinds of what's called it's spiritually transformative experiences. It's not only NDE. I read this wonderful book by Yvonne Casson about when she compared different touched by the light, different kinds of meditation and all that kind of experience. And these are transformative deeply in the person. That is something else than just reading in research papers and say, oh, well, that sounds plausible. I try to decide to believe in these. So I think that's depending on, so to say.
I agree. I don't know what to add to that. I mean, as Stan Krippner said in his comment, these are deeply transformative experiences. Revel in them. There's very little need to question them. We're typically approaching them from what's called a clinical parapsychology point of view, which is looking at the health benefits. The Bigelow essay, in a way, started to challenge the claims because we were looking at the best evidence that left very few alternative explanations. But we rarely get to do that. Again, it's sort of game playing with education and what kind of research that we do. But that it has been done. But we're understanding a lot more about the experiences by looking at the health impact and how they better people, how we can make overlaps to positive psychology and motivation and emotion. And so we're learning so much about that. It won't do anyone any good if you tell me about your after-death communication for me to say, let me tell you why I think you had that experience, and I'll take it all away from you. It's because you saw this out the corner of your eye and you misinterpreted this or that. That's going to do no one any good. If I've already seen that you're so happy you had it, why should I? It's not my right to take that away from you. So it's great that you had it, and it's great that it was a very real experience for you. I can't say one way or the other what it really was, so I shouldn't even attempt to. But it's fair for me to try and understand how it's made you better by having had it.
I have a question that is making the issue a little more complicated. If there is something like a consciousness surviving the bodily death, and if I connect that with cases suggesting reincarnation, I notice there are cases where you have biological birth defect or some other biological thing connected to the way you died, lost life.
Skin pigmentation.
How can even the body be influenced in this survival? I mean, something survives, but also something also influencing the body that is born with this birth defect that is corresponding to something happening, how you died.
How it's doing it is making the big assumption that that is definitely the case, that someone has died and that has passed through. It's down to our interpretation, though, that it relates. It's interesting that it adds to the story that someone already has, that they have these alleged memories of a previous life that also are mixing in with their present one, and they can remember ways in which they died and another family that could be followed up. But in those cases, you have to question which followed first. Was it recognition of this abnormality on their skin or whatever it may be, and then putting a story to it? Well, this was questioned, though. Even Ian Stevenson, who did the book on biology and reincarnation, questioned which is coming first, which is an important question. Are they putting a story to something they've identified, or is the story coming to something first and then it relates to that deformation that they may have?
I mean, if you only have a birth defect, doesn't mean you have anything else, but you must, of course, have some kind of memory that causes you to have an interest in this thing. If they have memory of getting a wound here...
It's interesting if the memory comes first and it is devoid of any exposure to something that would make them develop a story based on it, if that makes sense.
But also if they have other memories, and recognise things from previous life.
My mum and dad have this name and they live in this town, and we know that that person has never visited there, but they look into it and they actually find that town, they find that family, they meet them, and indeed they did have a son or daughter that passed away in such ways. Because it was questioned in his book. There were things like stabbings, gunshot wound, falling and injury to the head, so there were certainly marks or damage to the skull, and there could be like a significant red birthmark here or something.
Marks have been run over.
Were there that as well? Wow. I mean,
so they had ribs broken in the previous
Some were amputation of the previous person, and for the present child they've got, say, an arm that hasn't actually fully developed during birth. So some things like that.
I mean, of course, in some ways that's not anomalous in the same degree, because there are parallels to the physical phenomenon in stigmata. I think cases like Padre Pio are pretty well evidenced that these phenomena result from a devout belief and expectation, and then physically that's reflected. Certainly in the time of animal magnetism, and we see also in some early hypnotism, that through the power of suggestion alone, people can physically respond. So if you touch somebody with a cold poker, but you tell them, you suggest to them that it's blazing hot out of the fire, they will blister. Now, whatever the mechanism is, it's a mundane biological mechanism that's leading from suggestion, but it happens. In the modern day, as well as the placebo effect, there's a nocebo effect. So people who believe they're receiving an active medicine will develop the side effects of that medicine as well. People who've been involved in open label placebo trials, so these are trials in which they know for sure that they're receiving the placebo, still derive benefit and have the side effects, and when the trial is over, the condition comes back again. Even though they know that it's just their psychology, and they plead to continue to receive the placebo, And ethically, you can't give them sugar pills to carry on because it's not allowed. It's bizarre.
Well, yeah.
I
So-
think the statistics are about, because we looked at it, I looked them up for when I gave a lecture on the power of positive thinking, so I mentioned placebo and nocebo. The nocebo is like 40 to 45% of people would pick up the negative side effects of the sugar pill or whatever it may be, because they'd heard about them as well. They knew what could potentially happen, and so for them it did, it became psychologically
And
more.
what's so astonishing about all of that for me is we have such power to heal ourselves, and yet we're not able to harness that ordinarily. We need some kind of device to bring it about in a surreptitious way. It's the most incredible thing. You would think in some way, evolutionarily, we'd have worked out how to use the power of positive thought in order to recover from cancers or, you know, broken limbs and things that might have been really dangerous for us in a previous era when we were hunter-gatherers. And we haven't worked that out.
No, no.
Maybe we have.
Okay.
To some degree.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
So
exactly.
maybe it's just a variable.
Yeah, I agree.
To
actually.
what degree?
Yeah, yeah. It's imperfect, but absolutely.
Okay, Jan?
Just comment on this discussion about bringing these biological effects on, and I think I mean the view of the consciousness as incarnating and discarnating. I mean it's not only the consciousness as I understand it in many spiritual traditions. It's a view of continued evolution, where of course there is, I mean, the concept of karma, that you bring something from your earlier existence into next. So I don't think it's not so awkward that we could bring something from that could be visible or so. So I mean it's an effect of this view of the spirit as continuous developing, I would say.
Again, it's an interesting point. I don't know how I could. I haven't got the answer to that. Is it? We can only assume when it comes to those things.
Exactly.
So
I mean, it depends on what kind of perspective you take when you try to explain. But I would say if there were a representative from different spiritual traditions, they could make such claims. But of course, if you have if the role of the associate professor, it's hard to do that, I would say.
Louis first, kanske.
Would it be a lot easier for people to recognize a life after death as real if there was a pretty good explanation, a plausible explanation to it, rather than just unknown?
What would count as an explanation? in that
Well,
case? What are
something
you
that
looking
we
for?
could test, obviously.
Okay. So
Because until in the beginning of the 1900s, there was a lot of professors around in Europe who did not believe in the existence of atoms. And then it was proven and proven and proven and finally came through. So it takes a lot for people to start thinking in new ways.
I think, but there's a real tension here as to whether the explanations you're looking for can be expressed wholly within the confines of the materialist worldview.
Well, there is some interconnection, we suppose.
Yeah, that certainly has to be.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a lot of talk, wasn't there, about what's his name now, the philosopher who is advocating a mentalism as physical as an expression of mental. No, his name was cropped up. But I mean, that view is becoming more popular now. That actually, in some ways, the physical world is an emanation of consciousness rather than, consciousness being, in a sense, a byproduct of, kind of idealism, form of that.
Panpsychism.
but views do shift. Sorry.
Yeah, maybe panpsychism.
No.
Yeah, that's more a God consciousness, isn't it?
Views do shift over time though, but it goes back to that point again that you just won't convince everyone. So I think it was John Cleese talking to Ian McGilchrist once that we were talking about nutrition research, and that it's taken nearly 100 years, though it's still not convinced all the researchers, to accept the fact that from looking at the numerous studies that they've done, that heart disease and heart failure was mainly caused by the consumption of sugars and not from fats.
Yeah.
But 100 years ago, it was believed that fat and fat-based foods were doing this. And you've got artificial fats and also natural fats as well, and same for sugars as well. They believe, because of the data showing it's sugars that is more in that direction. But that's what the data says, and it's ruled out this whole idea, assumptions people had about fats. But it's still not going to convince all of them, but at least now nutrition aims down that direction because they're following the data. Slowly. Well, they referred to, or I can't remember whether John said it or whether I started to come up with this idea, but it was like trying to turn like one of those ocean liner tankers around that's got all the numerous crates of cars and you name it, and it's like half a mile long. How long does that take to turn around? It takes a long time. You can do it. It takes a lot of effort, but it can turn around and go back in the opposite direction.
Okay, Mikael?
Well, I think you can have a top-down approach. So I met a cosmologist, André Linde, who is leading in the world many years ago, and he wrote an article, he was interviewed in the New York Times, where he said, of course, life, we cannot die or something, but we are not prepared for this truth. And you have Frank Tipler wrote a book where afterlife is impossible to deny, so to speak, from quantum physics. And he wrote this book, very, very famous, about anthropic principle with John Barrow, who, sat around with Stephen Hawking. And so you have quite a few physicists that show that information is indestructible, and whatever we want to get into the afterlife will probably be in the form of information. So once you have an established post-material physicalist worldview, then death will be hard to explain. How could you die? I had a friend who was a psychology professor, and I tried to see, are there any proofs that people can die? I mean, in the physical sense. So if you turn the problem over, if we live within this construct, death is inevitable and total, but if we go to the physics, you go to the natural philosophy we have developed, then death becomes a hard problem. That's my point of view. Okay.
I guess I'm thinking that kind of response would be unsatisfying for a majority of lay people. That when they think of survival, they don't think of it surviving in an informational way. In most circumstances, the matter of which we're made will continue to exist unchanged after our demise, and people wouldn't see that as survival either. Classically, they tend to think in terms of some feature of their personality and their interests and concerns in a coherent way being the thing that survives.
But
So
you have this thing with curiosity and hope. And even a psychopath or anyone can have a very, very small glimpse of hope. It makes such a difference for people in a very dark place.
Hade du någonting, Bertil?
Oh, yeah. I think some of these questions are already answered, but I think what I feel is we talk about the evolution of individual consciousness, but there are several theories about evolutional consciousness overall, so to speak. And it gives me a feeling sometimes that referring to previous research, we are going backwards to really get the grip of what we are doing. At the same time, evolutional consciousness continues. So it's like it's running away from us. Mm-hmm. It's a problem from the evolutionary point of view, actually. So how do you, because I never seen in these ratings and so that evolution in that way is considered at all. I haven't seen it.
I think it's a common feature of transpersonal psychology, influenced by people like
Yeah,
our
because
book
this
and
is-
Cosmic Consciousness.
This is why we are coming back, but I wanted to bring up.
I think it's captured as well. So somebody like Roger Nelson talks about the new sphere. So again, that's a notion of an evolution in collective consciousness.
Yes.
That something like the Global Consciousness Project is
Yeah.
intended in a kind of sideways way to tap into.
And in esotericism, where I'm working along, we talk about the evolution of the planetary consciousness.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So that fits
So,
with that.
so it's like a lot of layers and everything is evolving.
As an aggregate or as an...
It's not only as an aggregate, that's interesting.
I can mention very shortly a name I came across two years ago, Marilyn Monk. Do you know her?
No?
I know the name, yeah.
She's a biologist from cell biology. She mentions about consciousness, that consciousness evolved.
Yeah.
She has found indications of consciousness in many levels of biology, from cells, all through the organism, all up to the cosmos.
Yeah. Okay.
She has another view of consciousness in evolving in life processes and also in humans, but from the very simple atom she finds indications.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
And that's quite a new view. I had a lecture.
Near to what
I had a lecture 4 weeks ago here about these quite new ideas. Where is consciousness, and how can you view? She understands consciousness to be on all these levels, and she has another view of consciousness, contra evolution. Quite new ideas. I had also
Is that the book you-
a lecture for SPR at the SPR conference about this.
What was the name?
Marilyn Monk.
Monk. Monk.
Marilyn Monk.
Marilyn.
Meredith Monk,
Marilyn.
Yes, Marilyn Monk.
not Meredith Monk.
Marilyn.
Marilyn
Okay,
Monk, yes.
okay.
I can give you the reference because I have.
Because Meredith
I
Monk is
write
the
about her in
former
the
No.
book.
So I was confused.
Okay.
I mean, even when you go back to early survival researchers, they were also looking at the development of consciousness post-death as well. So that's where you get all the idea of the spheres and going up to these different layers and getting higher and higher and more interconnected, and a greater spiritual being. So Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, Hudson Tussle, Robert Hare, these are all people that propose what these different spheres would be like and what they contain.
That is hierarchical too.
Yeah.
And this is, I think, important
Yeah.
to be able to handle.
Erik och Louis kvar. Louis?
I wonder, people that had near-death experiences, they always identified their experience with themselves. It was always personal, right? So there's no question. I was there. I experienced this. So there's a clear identification. Is that correct?
I couldn't say that is always the case, but absolutely that's the pattern. Yeah, they have a centre of consciousness that they identify as still themselves.
Which makes sense, as you mentioned yesterday, about certainty of anything and being your own consciousness. Your awareness of this, but even in a dream, you're certain of your own perspective and state. So I can imagine in a near-death experience as well, that's something you're still very certain of, is your awareness and taking in of the experience. Even if you are depicting yourself as being a table or a horse or whatever it is, you've transformed into something else, but you are still aware that you are something else, experiencing something, just you, the individual. So it seems that whatever state you're in, that's still the certainty. Though I agree with you, I'm not overly clear if there may be some NDEs reported where that's not the case. Yeah.
Okay, I think we have to close here.
Oh.
How do you do that? How do you
We start-
any
My
questions?
last question is about the rumor and also the film with the name 25 gram. That when a person dies, he loses exactly 25 grams, and that's the weight of the soul.
Yeah.
Where does that rumor or
I don't know if it's exactly 25 grams. There was a nice summary paper of that. It's not so hard to access now. Maybe some of these things should get reprinted or end up in a book anthology or something. But there was a journal called Theta, from the Psychical Research Foundation, which I think William Roll was the president of that for a long time. And I don't know if it was maybe Gerd Hovelman that summarised it, but it was to do with the weighing of the soul at the point of death. So he brought up the Faraday studies of the 1850s and various other ones. And yes, there was an unaccountable weight loss. Whether it's consistently 25 grams is much like the problem we had with, say, infrasound, and knowing that low frequency sound in buildings and anywhere else can cause a sense of presence, hair standing up on the back of your neck or arms, a smearing of vision in the room that you may be in or the environment that you're in, all adding, thinking that you're having a haunting type experience. Now, when Vic Tandy discovered infrasound and started to look at it, he realised it was around the point of 19 hertz. That was the start of the research, and a film picked this up, and the idea of hauntings having an association with it. So the film was called 19 hertz. Infrasound isn't that though. Infrasound is anything below 20 hertz really, and it's a fluctuation. It's not a standing wave. It doesn't just stay at 19 hertz. It's all over the place because it's naturally occurring, and we've got a lot of artificial things that make it occur as well. So to know that you've got ripples in the bath when you're in the bathtub, the water's got to keep moving. You've got to splash and it goes to the end, and when it gets to the end, all it can do is come back again. It does that. And it will either get stronger because you keep splashing, or it will die down because you've decided to stay still. But it's not one continuous splash all the way back that keeps going. Even a Newton's cradle after time slows down if it's not got some acting force against it. So 25 grams, I think there will be a variation from those studies. And then even John Kruth, who's the director of the Rhine Research Centre, he mentioned there have been some other studies done with animals on such weighing scale beds where they were put in sealed plastic bags as well. So it was trying to account for any liquids or gases that may escape from the body at that point, so they're still sealed and contained within. I remember when doing science at school that we were weighing balloons full of air to see if it was possible. It was on a very crude scale, obviously, but the fact that you can still take into account air that's in whatever it is that you're measuring in the liquids and so forth, there was still some missing weight with the animals.
I have a recollection that Bernard Carr has been previously very interested in that particular line of research, and he's going to be a guest here soon, isn't he?
Yeah, yes.
So it might be worth asking him as well about that.
Yeah.
I can't imagine he's conducted any research directly. I don't think that would be very ethical.
But he studied the
He has, I believe so. Yeah.
I think the media is to blame though. They're just like 19 hertz. I don't think 25 grams is.
But there is some indication.
Oh yeah,
some kind of loss.
I don't deny that there's data looking at that, and that there is some sort of loss, but that the media then kind of puts some signpost on it. And
But the thing is, I mean, Peter never mentioned it today, but part of the deathbed experience is some kind of emanation from the body. And it may be a light phenomenon, but it may be a mist phenomenon. It may be much more tangible than that, but it varies from experience to experience. So people not quite often, sometimes claim to have witnessed something leaving the body at the point of death.
Yeah.
So
It's very
that's
important.
what that
25 grams of electromagnetic radiation, that's a huge amount
Well, exactly.
of
Yeah,
energy.
so yeah.
That's really
It's more likely to be an expiration of a dying body, and then no breath in. Is it not something like that?
Thanks.
Okay, many thanks for these questions and discussions.